So I think we'll make a start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this event, which is an afternoon-long discussion around narrative research and everyday life to mark the appearance of the second edition of Doing Narrative Research, the second expanded edition of Doing Narrative Research, which is really another book entirely with the new chapters and so on inside it. And we're very lucky to be able to have this discussion event here at the Institute of Education. We'd very much like to thank the Institute of Education, particularly Anne Phoenix, who's the principal investigator for the Novella program, which is based at the Institute of Education, in which CNR is also, the Centre for Narrative Research is also a partner. So we're very happy to be doing this with Novella, which stands indeed for narratives of varied everyday lives and linked approaches. So the everyday is an important aspect of this work, and indeed increasingly, I think, of the second edition that we have here. I'd like to thank also the National Centre for Research Methods, which funds Novella and has also supported this event. And also Sage Publications, who's supported the event too, and has particularly supported the launch party at, what time is that actually, at 5? 5:30? 5:30. So Sage is very, very kindly sponsored all that. And I'd also like to thank, of course, all the authors of the book, some of whom could be here, as you'll hear from them, the chapter authors. And some other of our CNR colleagues who've been really helpful in the production of the book, in particular Chidam Esten and Masih Fatih, who's here somewhere. I'd also, of course, like to thank my co-editors on the book, Maria Tambuku and Molly Andrews. And Molly, too, especially for setting this whole day up, doing most of the work. Along with Rowena, who's back here, who you probably met. And doing here also from Novella, who've done loads of work for this, which we really appreciate very much. So the format is, as you see on the program here, we're going to stick relatively closely to that, I think. So I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit. It's being recorded. Yeah. What we're going to do in terms of recording is that the presentations are being recorded, and we are also going to record question and answer discussions. If you don't want your contribution to be included in the recording, please give your name afterwards to Ding, I think, or to Rowena, and they can edit out anything that you would prefer not to be in the audio recording. So I just want to start off by showing you a few short quotes, fairly short quotes. This is one from Roland Barthes, from some of his early writing on narrative, actually the structure of narrative, in which he talks about the variety of narrative. I'm not going to read it out, but he goes through all the different forms of narrative that exist in his account. Pictures, gestures, stained glass windows, conversations, the local news, art, all these kinds of things. And then at the end he says, how are we to control such variety? How are we to justify our right to distinguish or recognize narratives? Okay, so I think faced with the variety in the book, that may be something that sometimes people, that may be a feeling that sometimes people get at the end of that book. And then this is a more recent, much more recent quotation from a talk given by the economist Tyler Cand. In 2009, he gave a talk in which he talked about his deep suspicion of stories, on the grounds that stories simplify, and that they make you too happy, and that they provide you with repetitive categories within which you become stuck, really. And that stories very often, and in his account pretty much always, actually hoover up messiness and complete incompleteness, and neaten things up. And he says at the end here, not everything ties up into a neat bow, and you're really not on a journey here. You know how people often tell you that they're on a journey on TV and so on. You're here for some messy reason or reasons, and maybe you don't know what it is, and maybe I don't know what it is. And he goes on in this vein, quite messily. Okay. So I think that's an interesting critique, and we quite often hear it, and I think it's something that has made its way into the changes happening in narrative research, actually, at the moment. And then this is from a talk by the novelist Chimamanda Adichie, also given in 2009, actually, in which she talks about the dangers of a single story. And she talks, I think, very compellingly about single stories and multiple stories. And here she says, this is pretty much towards the end of her very critical account of single stories, actually, that she says that stories matter and that many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, and she gives many examples, actually. But stories can also repair that broken dignity. So I think hers is a very nuanced and nice account of the places of narratives, and hopefully something of that ambiguity is in the Doing Narrative Research book, perhaps more than before. So in terms of the book that we now have, which now seems like the real book, and the other one seems like the less real one to us, I guess. What's changing it now is that we have a whole section that deals with different kinds of narrative media other than spoken and written narratives. So now that there's a chapter on visual narratives by Susan Bell, a chapter on narratives conducted in and through the body by Lars Christer Hudin, a chapter on digital narratives by Mark Davis, and a chapter on transmedia narratives, story worlds as it calls them, by David Herman. And I think that adheres, in the sense that change does bring the book to adhere more closely to the narratives of everydayness that we could see Bart talking about in the first extract, or not only everydayness, but certainly everydayness includes stories kind of cross-medially connected in this way. And what's also interesting about that is that it takes the book itself a little bit away from the temporality of narratives as the only form of structuration of them, and towards other kinds of structuring on the body and on other forms, through other forms of spatiality. I think kind of in parallel with this, there's an emphasis in the book on precisely that stuff of messiness that the second quotation says is not within narrative. This quotation from Tyler Cowen suggested that narratives suppress mess. But in fact, in the book as it stands, there's quite a lot of mess, and I think people end up quite often feeling that perhaps as a difficulty, although we see it as quite productive. And this is really, I think, in line with how narrative research has developed, really, since the first edition, that there is now a lot more emphasis particularly on incoherence within narratives. Maria Tambuku, one of the co-editors, has written a lot on that in collaboration with some of our other colleagues. And also as an emphasis on particularity and multiplicity of narratives. So that there's criticisms of narratives as suppressing mess. I think people interested in narratives as themselves suppressing mess are perhaps less, stand less firmly now in the research arena anyway. And then in the last chapter of the book, a kind of afterword written by Jens Brockmeyer, that chapter talks about the performance of narratives and the contexts of narratives, and says that these aspects now really kind of take I think it throws a monkey wrench into the kind of the clearer pictures of narratives that we were living with before. And he's really talking in that section, the afterword, about his own reactions to reading the whole book and how he feels that the research picture now has this kind of monkey wrench thrown into it. And his own chapter is, in a sense, a quite elegant monkey wrench itself, I think, at the end of the book. And his comments there are really, I think, kind of an echoing of the other new chapter in the book, which is a chapter written by Harry Lutz and his colleagues in Belgium on Deleuzian approaches to narrative work. I think those are really the changes that one can see in this book in comparison to the previous book, and I think it is it's in some ways not very different to the changes that have been happening within narrative research in general, and that shift has also been indeed a shift towards paying attention to the matter of everydayness in stories, and the different modalities of that everydayness, the particularity of it, and the way in which it is audienced and performed, and always not just text but context. So those are the changes that I think I've seen anyway working editorial on this book, and hopefully we'll hear more about how other people see that during the rest of the afternoon.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, it's a real delight to be at this occasion, because one of the things that has really partly led to Novella taking the form that it has, and also really helped to take it forward, has been our collaboration at TCRU with the Centre for Narrative Research. And without that collaboration, Novella would not be what it is. So it's really fitting that a book that helped us think lots of Novella ideas in the first place should have its second edition towards the end of Novella life. Not really towards the end, we've still got almost a year to go. So I'm really pleased that we're doing this. And I think my colleague Julia will say a little bit more later about some of the things that the book provides for us at Novella. But we wanted very much, in naming something, Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches, to think through the ways in which the everyday is increasingly coming to be recognised in the social sciences, but also in the humanities, as crucial to getting a full and holistic understanding of what's happening in disciplines and indeed in life. So the humanities do it. I mean, I've been struck recently by increasing interest, for example, in marginalia, both in social sciences from us at Novella, but also with people in English and history who are interested in the everyday practices of writing in margins of books, for example, as well as when people are thinking about things much further back in history, they're now coming to look at the minutiae of everyday practices. So we wanted to look at that. We wanted to think about the everyday. And one reason, very cogently put by Holway and Jefferson in both their 2000 book and the second edition in 2012, is that often when social scientists are thinking about their disciplines and thinking about life, they're far less complex than ordinary people are in their everyday lives. And that's partly because frequently they try to do something rarefied, which means that they have to reduce the complexity of material to something that doesn't then reflect the everyday. And as Corinne has said, the everyday is in itself complex and messy, but it's where we should be aiming, really. And I think that this edition of Doing Narrative Research, even more than the first, illuminates the possibilities, and in its broader sense, the possibilities of studying everyday life. And I want to read this quote, which comes from 1980, because it seems to me that it does some very useful things in terms of thinking about the everyday. So it's Luce Giard, and written originally in French, and it's in The Practice of Everyday Life, which is an often cited volume by de Certeau and Giard and Mayotte, who've edited it. And Luce says, in each case, doing cooking is the medium for a basic, humble, and persistent practice that is repeated in time and space, rooted in the fabric of relationships to others and to oneself, marked by the family saga and the history of each, bound to childhood memory, just like rhythms and seasons. And I've skipped out a bit. A woman's worry, will the cake be moist enough? A woman's observation, these tomatoes are not very juicy, I'll have to add some water while they cook. A transmission of knowledge, my mother, or aunt or grandmother, always told me to add a drop of vinegar to grilled pork ribs. A series of techniques, tour de main, that one must observe before being able to imitate them. To loosen a crepe, you must give the pan a sharp rap like this. These are multifaceted activities that people consider very simple or even a little stupid, except in the rare cases where they're carried out with a certain degree of excellence, with extreme refinement. But then it becomes the business of great chefs, who of course are men. And then I've skipped out quite a bit. This culinary work is alleged to be devoid of mystery and grandeur, but it unfurls in a complex montage of things to be done according to a predetermined chronological sequence: planning, organising and shopping, preparing and serving, clearing, putting away and tidying up. It haunts the memories of novelists. And I think you'll see that there's a great deal there that underlines the complexity of something that's often thought to be very simple. One of the key features is, by focusing on the everyday, one of the things that we do is often to make visible the things that are taken for granted and so left invisible. They're very much taken for granted. And there are many people like Susie Scott at Sussex and Stomka, who I'm not sure where she is actually, who talk about these issues around practices, making visible the invisible, and the fact that practices, everyday practices, are often taken for granted and so not attended to. In Giard's case, she talks about kitchen women nation, because she's very much seeing the gender that's left invisible in the cooking and in what women do at home. So she's talking about doing cooking as repetitive, performative and relational. So things that Corinne has highlighted already, apart from the relationality, that the everyday is frequently repetitive and it's performative. You're doing something with it and it's certainly relational. And what Giard is pointing to very much in a kind of almost sarcastic way is the gender inequalities. So great cooks are chefs and they're men, she says, and women just do the everyday. So she's celebrating unrecognised skills, but she's also, in that short sequence, but in her chapter as well, memorialising intergenerational passing on of skills, that transmission of skilled work. Cooking is not an unskilled thing. We don't all know how to do it from the moment we were born. At least I certainly didn't. I mean, some of you may have known intuitively. But actually, that would be very good, actually, if you thought you knew intuitively, because the intuitive is always practiced and not thought about, always part of the everyday. But what's less clear from Giard's account, except that she does sometimes talk about France, for example, is that the account itself and all everyday practices are geographically located and historically bound. So things change incrementally. And one of the ways in which there have been changes is that she's perhaps too absolutist about gender. There are many men now, many more men than when she was writing in 1980, who do cooking and who are perhaps responsible for all the cooking or who do all the shopping and so on. So that actually things have changed a bit. She also takes for granted that French cooking is wonderful and is admired by countries all around, which in 1980 certainly it was. I think it still is, but probably less so now, when I think that in Britain we think that we have, not necessarily because we cook it at home, but we have wonderful cuisine because of our globalised relations, because of the quotes, margins in the centre here. But it's also one of the things that are key to the everyday as well, is that the micro and the macro are inextricably linked, that you can see them there. And you can see them, for example, in the gendered power relations she's alluding to when she's talking about chefs, that the macro relations of gender, but also the macro relations to do with nation are all represented there. What's perhaps less clear is agency. I can see Molly looking at her watch. I will hurry up. Okay, I wanted also to cite Langelier and Peterson, but perhaps I won't do very much, apart from just saying, they start this chapter by saying, with a number of different things, a number of different ways in which people are used to speaking. Let me tell you about something that happened to me. One friend tells another as they walk through the park. So how did your school day go? Asks a family member at the dinner table. Did you see last night's episode on the television? Blah, blah, and so on and so forth, okay? you'll never guess what happened today, begins the latest entry in an online internet journal, and so on. And they say, what these simple speech acts announce, request, declare, promise, and invoke stories. They perform narrative. Such storytelling matters. It is an integral and consequential part of daily life. And I think that's the point that I want to make, that narrative and the everyday are inextricably linked in very interesting ways. So narratives and narrative performances, such as they're talking about, are crucial, and they're a ubiquitous part of everyday life as well. They are the most common way in which people make sense of their own experiences and also claim identities, and the claiming of identities in the everyday, sometimes overtly and sometimes by the taken for granted, are things that I think are really important. Okay, I'll skip the rest of that, except to say that this point about social policy and that it matters the way in which we narrate our stories. So one of the points about novella, one of the points about doing narrative research as a text, is that various authors or the whole research programme are making claims to analyse, understand and present particular versions of the social world, of the everyday, and those matter. They're consequential in a number of different ways. And just if I have this quick quote from Highmore, 2002, for everyday life stories, Foucault could act as a kind of caution for anyone claiming too hastily that the attention towards everyday life is simply beneficial and needs to be encouraged. The everyday has been continually invaded by a certain scrutiny for the effective governance of social subjects, and for the most part, that scrutiny has accompanied the policing of everyday life. Sexual practices, hygiene, family life, work regimes, diet have continually been seen as the province of governmental agents. And the reason that I think that that's important is that it frequently is the case that other people are looking at the everyday in order to police and control. And therefore it's even more important that in research we think about how we want to represent the everyday. So it's consequential, it matters. And perhaps I'll just stop there before. Sorry. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Karin and Anne for actually framing what we're trying to do, both in the book, but today as well, in a wider context. And Anne, I'm sorry, because I can see that you have beautiful slides there, which would be very thought-provoking, and my job at this moment is just to keep us a little more curtailed. But just to tell you that the next session, we have two panels in which we will ask contributors to the volumes to give very, very short, that's to say less than 10 minutes or up to 10 minutes, Tracy, about not really what's contained in their chapter, because you can read that for yourself, but in fact to actually think about connecting their research, our research, to questions of everyday narratives, okay? Because in fact, exactly the work that Anne has just been indicating really does pose for us a really important theoretical, but also political challenge, how to actually take everyday experiences as our starting point and to connect them. So, without any more ado, the first panel will actually be three speakers. You'll see some of us wearing two hats today, okay? So, in fact, you're going to see Anne up here again, and Maria and Wendy. So we'll have these three presentations, and then we will have Stephanie Taylor, who's really, really kindly agreed to act as discussant for this first bit. And then we can have questions and discussion from you, then we'll have tea, and then we'll do it again with a second panel. And, okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Wendy Patterson, who I have to say really did some absolutely critical work which kicked us off in this field. When did that come out? It was 2000 or something, is that right? Yeah. And Wendy, very fittingly, was and still is, I think, the first real chapter in the book. So, thank you.
Thank you. Hello everyone, it's lovely to be here. It's especially lovely to be here because I'm not all that active in the narrative area anymore, unfortunately. But I retain a great interest in it. And I was really pleased to hear about the book having a new edition. And I wasn't surprised because over the years since it came out, I quite regularly get emails from readers who've noticed my email address at the end of my chapter on Lvov. And so about every month or every other month I get an email from someone somewhere in the world saying, oh, I've read this and I'm interested in this, or could I have a copy of your work on narratives of trauma, which I'm really happy to email them. And that's meant that although, as I say, I'm in a slightly different area now, it has helped me keep up an interest, and I've really enjoyed the communication with readers across the world. I had a little bit more communication actually with a reader at the beginning of the year who had read my work on narratives of trauma and asked me whether any of it had been applied in the areas of either grief or trauma counselling or psychotherapy. And it hasn't, and that sort of gave me the idea of going back and looking at it again, because a lot of the theoretical stuff has appeared, but not the actual ideas I used when I analysed the narratives and produced a model of the trauma narrative. So I went back and looked at it and thought, yeah, this is still quite good. And the way that people tell their stories hasn't actually changed in the years since I wrote it. And so having been actually given the lovely opportunity of appearing here today and having a chat with you, I thought I would just explain a few of those ideas in the hope that there will be others here who may have ideas about whether it would be a possibility to apply them in the way I described, either in training with the idea of how you can hear a story of a traumatic experience, how you can actually listen in a narrative way. Okay, so I came into narrative through Lvov with a history in linguistics, and that was how I became interested in narrative, his idea that narrative mediates experience, i.e. somehow changes, transforms, alters, and I wanted to find out exactly how. How does narrative mediate experience? And I also used the work of Ricoeur on this as well. Okay, so I've got a slide of the model of a trauma narrative. Okay, so here's the model of a trauma narrative, which I came up with through analysing narratives of trauma. So the bottom one is my model, which I mapped on to the structural model of narrative. And so in here we've got the various elements which appeared through the narratives of trauma that I analysed. Within those, there's lots of different elements which I analysed in various different ways. The point I'd make here, and then I'll close, and if anyone wants to come and speak to me afterwards about all the elements and the various ideas I've got, I'll continue with that. But the point I would make here that I'm always writing about and speaking about the narratives. I'm never talking about the experience of trauma or the experience of coping in the aftermath of trauma. I'm not suggesting that anything like that actually could ever be reduced to a schematic model, but I'm always talking about how people speak or write about the traumatic experience. I'm sure I don't have to stress that. And so if I just show you very quickly the different elements of the model. So the X and Y, I was just making a meal when X happened. In one case, this was a call that a child has been injured in a car accident and is in hospital. And then the immediate aftermath, where narrators talk about the numbness and the madness and the re-traumatisation, and it's the specifics of each one and how they relate. And so in the I was making a meal and we had a call, and this was the news that the child has been injured in an accident and in hospital. Then in the section of talking about the numbness and madness and the re-traumatisation, again, you get this XY structure. Ever after, or for a long time after, making a meal is impossible. It's the whole of everyday life, the normality of cooking, it's gone. Actually, can't even make a sandwich, never mind cook a meal. And the madness elements of the stories, at the time the stories are being told again, the person is not mad. And so it's a person who's survived and is telling the story of a time when they were mad, and how that was experienced. And then the meaning making, that is an element of all of them, sort of why and who's to blame. And then endings, and they've got a query over them, because of course you can't always have endings. And I take the point of the person who was quoted, I think it was Cowan, about messiness in narratives. And the fact is, I think through experiences of this traumatic nature, there's a whole lot of messiness, but in time, and most of the narrators I interviewed, the event had been some years earlier, the messiness actually can be resolved a bit into a coherent story that, as Ricoeur explains, is always holding together the past and the present and the future, and that's why I talk about them always be an ending of the story, always being a beginning. Thank you. So I just switch this up. Thank you for listening.
All right. I'll just be very quick because I know Molly is very strict, and so I'll be right to the point. In a symposium on the future of feminist narratology, which happened at Anglia Ruskin just last week, Susan Lancers suggested that it's high time we turned our attention from what a story is to what a story does, but also, most importantly, to how it does it. Now, in my research so far, I have indeed focused on the effects of stories. So I have asked the question of how, more in terms of what are the conditions of possibility for a story to emerge, how has this story emerged? And my chapter in the book is really an elaboration of this Foucauldian question and this Foucauldian approach. However, as years go by, I have been more and more interested in a different question around the how. This question around the how has never become for me a question of genre. So I'm not interested when I look into what Hayden White talks about as the content of the form. I'm not interested in how the genre or the form imposes itself on the content. I'm rather interested in how the form actually inspires new stories to be written or told. And here I have an example of such a form generating a story. The story comes from a letter that Fania Kohn, who was a labor organizer in the garment industry in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century, she writes a letter to a friend and comrade in the labor movement, and through the letter she tells the story. Now, the story of her life. Why I was interested in this was because Fania Kohn, I worked for a whole summer with her papers at the New York Public Library. So she was a voluminous writer. She wrote a lot of labor essays. She wrote plays for labor drama. She wrote a lot of around workers' education. So she was not a woman that she couldn't write. However, she never wrote an autobiography or a diary, and we would never know anything about her life unless we had read these letters. Later on, I found the same mode of women trade unionists telling their stories through letters when I was working in Boston with the papers of Pauline Newman, who was also a significant figure in the history of the labor movement. So these letters have given me the idea of starting wondering about the form. What is in the epistolary form, I have been asking, that creates inspiration for women organizers and trade unionists to tell their story? And in working around these questions, around the epistolary form, I have come with this idea that Italian philosopher Adriana Cavarero talks about when she theorizes narratives as a relational exchange. So the idea I have come up with is that the letter actually offers the form of a change. The moment when you offer the story to another as a gift. And the letter actually formalizes this scene of exchange. And although, of course, we know from Judith Butler that this scene of exchange, of the reciprocal narrative, is always incomplete because it's always constrained by the discourses and practices of the era, I do not, of course, downplay this. My first approach to narratives is a Foucauldian approach, but in recent years I have been much more interested in this scene of exchange, which comes closer to a kind of existential philosophy, mostly through my interest in Hannah Arendt and Cavarero, who is actually very much inspired by Arendt's approach to narratives as an exchange, a gift of stories. So, to come back to the topic of the everydayness, as I have been working with letters that come from women labor organizers in the trade union movement, I'm thinking about some everyday events that are so crucial today, but also so much rooted in the past that I have been talking about. More specifically, I'm thinking of the hardships and plight of garment workers, and particularly women, which have sadly become a daily piece of news, with the Rana Plaza collapse in Dhaka in April 2013 being the most tragic event in a series of fatal accidents in recent years. It is, I think, as we have never stopped listening to Thomas Hood's Song of the Shirt, and reading Mayhew's reports from the sweatshops of East London. These places and spaces of destitution have now been transferred to countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Mexico, amongst others, where women garment workers struggle to survive while doing their work, creating the cheap clothes that we in the West buy and wear, an example of everyday practices that we take for granted, as Anna very lucidly presented them. But together with the indignation about the sometimes unbearable conditions of garment workers worldwide, the majority of whom are women, comes the news of their ongoing struggles to resist exploitation and act together for better conditions of work and more widely for a better life. One might wonder how far indeed have we come after a century of women's struggles in the garment industry and more than 50 years of scholarship in women's labor history. How much have things changed, and to what extent do they remain the same or different but equally oppressive and unbearable for the seamstress? These are some of the questions that come up today as narratives of everyday life. And it is through narrative research, I argue, that we open up paths to investigate them. Thanks.
I'm going to simply do a very little, and don't worry, this is simply a representation of novella. It's not something I'm going to go into in any detail. I'm simply going to point out that I'm going to give examples from one of the project, and in fact I'll give one example, I think, the Family Lives and the Environment Across Continents study within novella. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. But first, as Corinne made very clear at the beginning, one of the things about the Doing Narrative Research book is that everybody takes their own particular way of thinking through narratives. And that doesn't mean to say that they've just invented it out of nowhere. As you've heard already from Wendy and Maria, they're very particular histories and literatures that they come from. But everybody has their own sensibilities around narrative that they're employing. So I just wanted to put some of mine up that come out in the chapter to some extent, but also a few that are relevant for the example that I'm going to give. First of all, that narrative skills develop early. And as somebody who's been very interested in young children and young people for a long time, I think that it's really important to recognise that they're also both born into narratives through their parents, who have stories for them before they're born, and also that they have their own narratives very early on. They learn very early familiarity with all sorts of genre. So, you know, the fairy story being one that's fairly early learned, and so on and so forth. It's also the case that I'm concerned with both big and small narratives that I think are important. So sometimes the things that don't appear to be a coherent big story, but nonetheless are narratively important in people's constructions of identities and so on. And I'm interested in temporality. Now some people are more interested, well, everybody's interested in sequence, but they're interested in other forms, as Corinne made clear, but I'm still interested in temporality itself and thinking about the way in which storied lives are important. So I want to give, at the moment, one example. I think I'll skip this one, the first one, and just give this one. The Family Lives and the Environment study is partly being done in Andhra Pradesh in India. And Catherine Walker, who's over there, and Natasha Shukla, collected data in Andhra Pradesh earlier this year and at the end of last year. And one of the things that really strikes me is if we're thinking about analysing narrative contexts, which is what I'm concerned with in that particular chapter, then there are some things that happen to children, or some preoccupations, some small stories that are not understandable unless we think in interesting ways about what context means. And yet, they're stories that make sense to us. So here, Madhavi is a co-researcher in Andhra Pradesh who's absolutely crucial because she translates, interprets, she translates now, from Telugu into English. So Madhavi asks in this individual interview with a girl, and these are girls and boys of 12 years old roughly. Are there any places or things which need to be restricted? Usually elders admonish youngsters not to go to certain places or not to do certain things due to some reasons. And she says, they never said anything. You don't have places like that around your house either? No, there is nothing. Didn't anybody say to you that it's dangerous for children to go to certain places? There are haystacks near our house, right? Often I go there to pluck henna leaves. So they tell me not to go there often because there may be snakes in that area. And they tell me to be careful and not to go there often. Okay, so not to go there at all, but not to go there often. And then I've skipped out a long bit, sorry. So Madhavi says, when did you see, and this is a snake, near our house? Is it so rare or common? Regular? Rare, rare. And Catherine says, I saw them, that's the snakes, 2 times. One night before going to bed, I wanted to use the toilet. And as I opened the outside door, I saw it clinging to the door itself, but I never saw it. I opened the door, went to the toilet and came back. While closing the door, I noticed that there is something large on the door. I went and brought my mother to see what it is. Mother woke my father and he said it was a snake. This happened recently. The other time was near the shed. My mother saw a snake next to the shed, and my mother kept me inside and called my father. She did not let me come outside. These are the 2 times I saw snakes. Okay? And the point that I want to make is that we all understand both why it might be fearful, why you might want to restrict children from going to certain places, and also why children might resist saying that they're restricted from particular places. But it's ununderstandable that it would be a small story in her life unless we knew that she lived in an area where flooding could lead to snakes proliferating and where uncleared brush could lead to snakes proliferating, and that people can be bitten by them. So it's very contextual. And I think I'll pretty much stop, but to quote here from the book itself, narrative remains defined by sequences within a specific order, temporal or otherwise, which takes it beyond description, and by a particularity that distinguishes it from theory. And here the particularity is the geographical situatedness, the fact that it's to do with particular age groups and so on, and, as Kathy Riesman says, that events are selected, organised, connected and evaluated as meaningful for a particular audience. And the reason that that's important is that she has selected particular episodes as being tellable, and not immediately, but when pushed, actually. And I see, sorry, I never even did put this. I was in such a hurry, I never did even put it on whole view. Okay, so it was so towards the end, you can see that it can fill the screen. Okay, and therefore it means that there are some key narratives for children and in childhood in India that are not key narratives for children here, but that are personal, canonical, and evaluative. They're small narratives, but nonetheless important. And we have to think about them as local, societal, and transnational. And I will stop there.
I think it's especially wonderful in these 3 very brief presentations we've had, also to see the new applications that these scholars have been taking their work into since we published the 2008 edition. It's really great. I mean, for all 3 of you. Anyway, Stephanie Taylor, thank you very much for offering some comments here.
Okay. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to make some comments. I'm not going to use the PowerPoint, which might be a little bit of a relief. But I've very much enjoyed looking at the book in the last few days, and also looking back to some of the other publications from some of the same people. And the comments, the presentations today have sort of brought together some of my own thoughts about all of this. I came to narrative from discourse, and I remember somebody saying to me once, I prefer narrative analysis to discourse analysis because it seems more respectful. You're not cutting all the words up. Well, I mean, we could have a discussion about whether that is what discourse analysis is and whether that is necessarily separate to, whether the two approaches are necessarily separate. But I think that narrative has always been really attractive for new researchers, and I'm rather guessing that quite a lot of the people here may be fairly new researchers, whether it's because they're involved in PhD work or perhaps not. Some of them, I'm sure, are very experienced as well. But narrative has always attracted new researchers because it starts from where they are, I think, and this is part of the everydayness. It looks like something that they can recognise. And of course, it doesn't stay there, else it wouldn't be research. One goes into an analytic process, there's some kind of distancing that's necessary. But another thing that's really interesting about narrative for new researchers is this variety that we've been hearing about. Because as you engage with narrative, you are necessarily pushed into confronting issues which all qualitative researchers and researchers working with text or language of any kind or images have to confront. But I think in some other approaches they're not quite forced into the conversations. Are we looking at event or experience? What's the status we're giving to what we are analysing and what we say about what we're analysing? Where are we there in that research process? And looking at the book again, I mean, the introduction sets out a lot of the sort of this or this issues, but the examples of the research as well show how it's necessary to constantly make decisions. And my own view of empirical research is that it's really important quite early on to recognise that there's no perfect piece of research, that there is always some point of compromise and decision making. And there's always some point where you say, I have decided to do this for the research. And the sheer variety of narrative research, I think, really brings that to the fore in a way that other approaches don't necessarily do quite so quickly. And then we've heard, for example, from Wendy that research, narrative research can go back to the everyday as well, of course, in applications, in different uses. But it would be wrong as well to think that it's static, and I mean the new edition of the book brings that out very well. But also how people talking here have talked about how their research has moved on, as Molly's just commented. And I think Maria's work, which I admire very much, moving from Foucauldian and for her more recent work with Deleuze, Cabrera and so on, shows how narrative is not isolated by itself, but has a place not just in the everyday life, but in academia. It's part of the ongoing conversations of academia as theoretical foci shift and people also go into new concerns. And I think that the use of the incorporation of the book into different kinds of data or media, data and media, are both, show us very much where people are now. And there's that questioning, is language enough? What else do we want to be looking at? But also, not just a case of amplifying, but also, what can we get by coming at things in a different way? And there's another set of conversations, and narrative comes into those. At the same time, it takes us back to everyday life. I like Maria's research again, it takes us back to the forms of everyday life, the letters. And of course, the point is, in qualitative research, that things are never used up. And the approach that people have studied letters for a long time, but their insights into letters as data and where that might take them keeps on changing, and the variety of narrative allows that that change can be taken on board, can be incorporated. So I won't say much more. People are probably wanting tea, but I think one of the things which has been most informative for me about narrative, and Anne's last example reminded me of it, was that a number of people who've been working in the field for a long time, like Catherine Kohler-Eastman, have gone back to earlier work and revisited it. And that in itself has been a kind of fantastic illustration of the changing academic field, but also, again, of this, what are the decisions we make? What are the different ways of doing things? What, for the research project, have we focused on, or have I, the researcher, focused on in this project that is different to the one before? And of course, one of the things that I think is more important than it was in the globalised world is differing contexts. And I think it's interesting that several of the people who've been speaking have referred to what would once have been called third world context as if they were over there somewhere. But a lot of the work in the book, and that we've heard about today, is reflecting our globalised research context and our globalised research concerns and how they come back to us, to our everyday. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I think Stephanie gave you the mistaken impression that you were just about to have tea, but you're not actually. You're going to have no, that's all right. That's you. Wonderful, wonderful. But when I say that, I'm having jest. But we do actually have a few more minutes as we wanted to have, and I want to open up the floor to any questions or comments from you. We'll also have this at the end of the second panel. So before you get your tea, would you like to work a little harder?
I know you're already there. About the kind of so what. So how do we link what we're finding out from narratives to social science?
Okay. So can you hear back there? So the question is about how do you actually link these narratives to questions of social policy? Is that right? Yeah. And would you mind?
Okay. It's the so what question.
Well, I think that's obviously a crucial question because we know very much that social policy is much more influenced by quantitative work, and particularly at the moment, for example, in the field of education, randomised controlled trials have been said to be a gold standard and so on. But nonetheless, having said that, we know that politicians are forever motivated by the individual story, and that it's the individual story that often moves on and gender. And if you think about election times, for example, how many people remember Jennifer's ear? Well, you have to be of a particular age to remember. Nobody but me.
No.
Oh, you do? Okay. And the huge impact that had. Individual stories really matter. And this is something that Molly has thought about quite a bit, Francesca Coletta, and so on. And it seems to me that what we have to do is to present stories in persuasive ways. And I don't mean by that one story from a participant after another, but the narrative that we produce, because that's the other layer of narrative, that the researcher produces a narrative. And I think that those narratives have to engage with the zeitgeist, with structures, the local, and what it means to take a holistic view of people, and keep on putting them out there, engaging with policy issues, rather than assuming that we can't actually change them. So I think that's what we have to do. We have to have alternative stories which link with the quantitative, link with, if it's appropriate, randomised controlled trials, which is something that Novella's not linking with that randomised controlled trials, but certainly with quantitative work as well, in order to present a holistic view. So I think that's important. But we must never forget that the stories that we tell matter. They make a difference, and they sometimes shift the way in which people understand the world.
Please.
I wonder if I could embellish on those comments that you made, because it's an area of interest. I won't say great, you know what we say. And I've got another question that I see the lecture. I want to hold that large for the next 12 speakers in case I forget anything. But in terms of narrative affecting policy, there was a report published in 1999 by the Institute of Medicine called To Err is Human. And that report continues to affect global policy in healthcare to this day. And when I say affect global policy in healthcare, I'm talking about changes in legislation across most of the, where we want to call the Western democracies or so forth, if we have actually any. It's resulted in the creation of organisations and institutions across the Western democracies and so on. And that report was essentially a narrative, and it contained within its very specific stories. So in terms of it actually, how can narrative affect policy? Massively is the answer. Hugely, internationally, it can have extraordinary effects upon policy.
Yes. Can I ask you, do you have a question with that as well, or just
adding
support for
an observation? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, for sure. That's, okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?